Graham is the national coordinator for the working group Delivering Democracy, Retrospect and Prospect. As we speak, the recording for this session has started. You would have seen a disclaimer at the beginning as you were logging in. By continuing to stay on the call, you consent to be recorded. I just want to formally call it out before we start the webinar. And Bhagwan, over to you for the quick video.
Okay. Is that visible?
Yeah, it's visible. I think we have a challenge with the audio, but nevertheless, let's go ahead. What you're seeing on the screen is a quick summary of the international conference on delivering democracy, retrospect and prospect. This was a two-day international conference which happened at the Art of Living Convention Center at Bengaluru.
Opportunities for women to rise to a wide position.
I think, Bhagwan, we can stop the video and I'll give the floor to Basavaraju to speak about Graham quickly. I think that will be a better way to deal with it. Can you take off the... Thank you. So may I call upon Dr. Basavaraju to do a quick introduction of Graham and then open the webinar formally.
Thank you, Jayashree. So good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all who have joined, all the panelists and participants joined from different parts of the world. I think we can call ourselves as crusaders of democracy. We, the civil society organization, always strive to uphold the principles and spirits of democracy. I'm truly honored to host this webinar as National Coordinator of Delivering Democracy Working Group in India. We at Delivering Democracy Working Group under G20 and C20 in India consider this as a privilege to have this opportunity to host speakers from Canada, Mexico, and Indonesia today. Also, we have an engaged audience from India and other G20 nations for this webinar today. It's a matter of pride for all of us in India to host a variety of engagements during our G20 presidency with the principles of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That means one earth, one family, and one future. Friends, our G20 presidency, under our G20 presidency, our Honorable Prime Minister gave a call to make this G20 a people's campaign and not just government's program. We under Delivering Democracy Working Group taking G20 to the grassroots. We are engaging various sections of community from ranging from students to panchayat, which is village self-government in our country, their members as well as parliamentarians. So we are taking these programs, the various engagement activities to campuses of various universities, and now to all of you, the democracy champions from all the G20 nations through this webinar. Our objective is to learn from all of you, that is all the G20 nations, on udaharans, what is called as best practices or examples and solutions for some of the issues we are encountering from decades in our countries actually. I'm sure you all agree that civil society has always played a role of a catalyst in upholding and strengthening the principles and spirit of democracy. I think it is important to have an enabling ecosystem for all the civil society organizations and it is very much necessary, and it should be fostered by any responsible country continuously. I'm sure we will get to learn more on strengthening civil society for deepening democracy, which is the topic of the day, and role of the state in doing this. So we at GRAM engaging with all 4 stakeholders of development through our evidence-based policy engagement activities. That is, we closely work with state, corporate organizations, civil society, academia, and community. GRAM researches issues at the grassroots and work at the policy level with the policy makers more closely, not only as a think tank, but also a think, do, and advocate tank. The organization, which was just an idea a decade ago, which is independently started without any seed funding or any grant from any organizations, now work across country, handle over 100 projects, and work with over 10 international organizations today. It's we consider this as an opportunity to strengthen a civil society movement working for good governance and democracy. At this juncture, I also thank Balavikasa for being our regional coordinator in Delivering Democracy Working Group, and also my dear friend Shauri for accepting to moderate and taking this forward. I also thank Benedito, our international coordinator of Delivering Democracy Working Group, who is not only taking part in the webinar today, but being a strength and support for us to make this webinar series more effective in all the 4 upcoming webinars. Actually, I also thank our generous, for the generous support of HSF, Hans Sidal Foundation, in all supporting all our NDOs. Thank you so much for joining us today, and let's have more enriching discussion and session. Over to Jayashree.
Thank you, Dr. Basavaraju. May I call upon Benedicto to do a quick introduction of yourself and the speakers and set a tone for the session, please. Over to you, Benedicto.
I'll do it with pleasure. Thank you so much. Let me thank all the people that is connected today and from all over the world, then to thanks the organizers, but also the speakers that join us. And so our main topic, as you have heard, is the role of the civil society as a catalyst stakeholder into strengthen democracy. But today our general aim is to try to understand more what is the role of the state regarding its relation with the civil society. So I have some questions on point as an example to set up a framework for our debate. So, for example, if the civil society needs general or global or local rules to be sustained by the states. So what are the numerical criteria, for example, in sustain and listen to the voices of civil society and to, let me say, treat all the voices equal by the states? Or is it the state in a globalized world still necessary and effective in playing the role, or it needs to scale up and look to states that together delegate this role to international actors? Is it the role of the state important to let the voices of the civil society listen? What about the role of the social media, for example, or traditional or new media in this sense? Has the state responsibility to regulate them, the media, also in this sense? Or, for example, the role of the state and the education, on the education, educate people to democracy, up the democracy. What does it mean today? So I think that about these questions and other points, I'd like to hear example, answers, practices, proposal from our speakers. And also I hope the audience will give to them interesting questions to let our time become deep in a real effective way. So doing that, I leave the floor to Shori to moderate this session, and thank you all. And I come back in 90 minutes or less just to summarize what we are about to say. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you, Benedito. Let me, before Shauri takes over, let me quickly help you see the speaker profiles.
You are on mute.
Thank you, Benedicto. I'm sorry, I was on mute and speaking. Before Shauri takes over, I would like to just quickly introduce the other speakers in the panel. So before I go to the speakers, Shauri is going to be the moderator. As you see, Shauri is the executive director of Bala Vikasa, who's the regional partner for us in this particular initiative. And Shauri will briefly speak about himself before he starts the moderation. We also have Binny Buchori, who's the founder and on the advisory board of the Prakasara Indonesia, one of the esteemed speaker in the panel. John Miller from Politicom in Canada is going to be the other speaker with us today. And Gloria is again joining us from Mexico. It's very early for her in Mexico, so I think she's not going to come on the video. That's what I guess. And Doug from US. So these are going to be the speakers with us today in the webinar. And Shauri is going to moderate the session from here forward. So over to you, Shauri, for a quick introduction of Bala Vikasa and then start off the webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Jayashree. And namaste to all the speakers from America, Indonesia, Mexico, Canada, and all the participants from across the globe. I think we have over 80 participants representing non-profits, corporate, elected leaders, activists. We have very good representation from different stakeholders. So just before getting into the speaker session, I'll just introduce 2 minutes about Bala Vikasa. I request Chandana to play a small video on Bala Vikasa, please.
We are not able to get the audio, so I think the video should do because we don't have any voiceovers or anything. Yeah, just give me a minute. I'll show.
And we are very happy to partner with Gram in conducting this big event, which is Pride to India to host G20. And we thank all the speakers for accepting to be part of this, though it was sometimes, for some people, it was very short notice. You have the video, Chandana? Otherwise, I can just simply talk 2 minutes and then I can close it.
I have the video on. No? Just share.
We're a non-profit based in India and operating in 6 states. It's a 45-year-old organization founded by a Canadian couple, Mrs. Bala Jangra and Andre Jangra. We are into multiple community development activities. They are our founders. We have reached 6,000 villages with variety of programs. And 5 million rural poor benefited from our programs. The numbers are not seen clearly. Basically, we are into implementing a lot of community-driven development programs in clean drinking water, women empowerment, water conservation, school education, different kind of programs. And we are one of the leading nonprofit in India, especially in clean drinking water, which is providing water to 3 million people in 1,000 villages. And we are not only implementing our organization, we are also a capacity building institute to nonprofits. So we are training NGOs and government officials from more than 80 countries from across the globe. So that makes Balavikasa as a globally inspiring training institute. And we are also a capacity building institute for corporates in CSR sector. And we are also a social startup incubator. So we are into 3 different activities. One is implementing programs, building the capacity of nonprofits from across the globe, and also providing advisory consultancy capacity building to corporates and startups. And then I can stop on.
This is good, Chandana. I think you can pull the video down, and Shauri, over to you.
Yeah. Good, thank you. Yeah, we'll go to, we have now 4 speakers from 4 different countries. We have from Canada, we have from US, Mexico, and Indonesia. And as you see the profiles, they have a very rich experience. They are working from on different platforms. Some are from civil society, some are from government background, some are from political background. So we can have a lot of deliberations. And as Douglas said, the main purpose of this session is to see the role of the state in strengthening the civil societies, because we believe civil societies play a big role between the citizens and the government to strengthen the democracy, right? So we would like to listen the experiences, the country context, and give us some examples so that the participants can also take inspiration from your experience and try their best in strengthening the democracy in their own countries. So first, I will now request John from Canada to share his experience.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. I'm very glad to be part of this illuminating conversation with such a distinguished group of field-tested experts and civil society leaders from diverse backgrounds and literally from all walks of life. It's very interesting, and I'm here to learn from you as much as I want to share some of my backgrounds. Yeah, I live in Canada, but my experience stems from a rich experience from working
John,
as
can I request you to put on your camera? Yeah. If
Give me
possible,
one
please. Can you
second.
put on it?
It doesn't appear. Okay, here. Do you see me now?
Yeah.
Because it's early in Canada, so I'm kind of trying to wake up as we go. Yeah. So I was saying that I work as an international development practitioner in like 20 countries from West Africa to Asia. My recent international trip was in Bangladesh, not very far from India, I would say. So we all know that a vibrant civil society is the cornerstone for a strong democracy and ultimately leads to more open and thriving society at large. This is why I really like this webinar's ambition, I would say, to explore the role of the state in strengthening civil society. It's a good and constructive way to put it, because from my personal experience, exploring the role of the state as a positive factor in strengthening CSOs is very ambitious. It's bold. It's to some extent counterintuitive, because even though in principle, state and CSOs or civil society are complementary rather than substitutes for each other or dedicated adversaries, as it's conceived in many places, I observed that drawing from my experiences that state overall, or government agencies or individual state agents can be a disruptive factor to CSOs by infringing on basic rights and liberties, weaponization of laws to establish restrictive environments for CSOs, especially those dedicated to advocacy and watchdog. So which means that when CSOs play the role of like service delivery, they can be seen more non-threatening than when they're asking questions about accountability and transparency. And I really, and the forum or the platform of the G20 offers that that unique combination of countries' experience from the West, but also from the global South, that can give for a good conversation. And I see that in Canada as well. It's not just like something for developing countries, but governments in Canada and the US and elsewhere are usually skeptical of CSOs when they are playing the role of a watchdog. And this is particularly challenging now. I don't know, some of you might have seen those reports from varieties of democracies, from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, but also from Freedom House, that confirms a certain trend of democratic backsliding across the globe. So this is a particularly important topic in the context of the G20 to explore the relationships between the state and civil society organizations. I use a framework to kind of analyze the relationship between the state and civil society organizations and how states can foster or strengthen civil society organizations to improve good governance and democracy. There is this civil society sustainability index that was published by the International Center for Nonprofit Law, ICNL, in partnership with FHI 360. Some of you may have known, and USAID publishes those things. They are like key areas. When you can look at the whole of the state, it can be positive, it can be negative, but I just laid there. Those factors are foundational factors for sustainability or strengthening of civil society organizations and what role the states can play. And I'll go through them quickly. There's the legal environment. Legal environment is does the government weaponize legal frameworks to impede or to weaken civil society organizations? Organizational capacity of CSOs. What is the role of the state to strengthen organization or structuration of CSOs? Do they use restrictive legal framework or environment to do that? Financial viability is another aspect. And the one that I would like to put emphasis on is advocacy. On advocacy, as we know, I mean, we're talking about delivering democracy. It's like on the market, there is the supply side, but there is the demand side. CSOs have demands about good governance, about legal framework, policy changes, policy prescriptions. One of the key factor, I would say, like in Canada, that is very, I think that is constructive, is how think tanks, civil society organizations, and NGOs develop that constructive relationships with policymakers and decision makers so that they can be part of the policy making space, or they can be shapers. Like civil society organizations can be shapers of policies. One example is the National Youth Council in Canada. The Prime Minister of Canada happens to be also the youth minister, and they created over the several years a youth council, and the Prime Minister is kind of leading it, and it's a mix of young leaders from various backgrounds, gender, uh, um, minorities, all orientations and geographic representation. They have this structured space where they voice recommendations, concerns of young people, not just the concerns of young people, but also on a setting that takes into account multiple factors of exclusion and discrimination. I just give one example because we have like 5 minutes, but I would say that it doesn't need to be that the relationship between the civil society organization and the state be a conflict prone kind of relationship where one is just asking and other is kind of balking or threatening the others. There is a way to create a more constructive way to engage, but that it takes some work, and to some extent, as Benedito was introducing, he was talking about a lot of issues like the use of social media. All those elements are double-edged swords. Like the new media, you can use it for positive influence on the policy making space, to influence social cohesion, but also it can be an element like an engine for fake news, division, polarization, and all these things. So I would say that I really like the way it's framed, this conversation, that trying to see the state as a positive influence on the civil society atmosphere, whereas in many places in the field where I go, civil society organizations are strategizing to protect or defend what they call the civic space, which is more a defensive mode. But this conversation is more constructive. It's open, and I would be glad to contribute, to participate and share my experiences as we move forward on that. So thank you for this opportunity. And I would also come back to say that let's look at those key factors for CSO sustainability and ask the questions in each individual country. What is the role of the state here, or what they can do better to foster a better legal environment for CSOs, for financial viability? Because I know in many places governments use legal measures, calling them foreign agents or any type of measures to impede NGOs or CSOs to have needed funding to perform, or closing space in terms of policy-making arena so that voices, especially marginalized voices, cannot reach power centers and policy-making differences. So let's look at those things, and we can share examples from your countries and from Canada as well, as much as I know, so that we can have a fruitful conversation. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to engage more as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you for being exact 10 minutes, completing your talk. And it's very, very wide subject you have covered, and you have given very good examples and the key points. One of the things, the financial sustainability, which is very, very essential for civil societies to play efficient role. That is very, very big issue, and that is the role of the state to be taken care wherever possible, right? So thank you so much for your input, and definitely we'll come back with more questions. So for all the participants, I forgot to inform in the beginning, please put your questions in the Q&A. After all the speakers present, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for answering your questions. So please take this opportunity to put your questions in the question and answer box there. Okay. So now we will, after Canada, we will go to Indonesia. We have Beni with a lot of experience from our country background, and also she has a lot of international exposure. So Beni, request you to present.
Thank you so much, Shauri. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Beni Bukhari. I'm the founder and sit as a as a member of the board advisory to a think tank, an NGO-based think tank called the Prakarsa. In addition to that, I have also served as a senior advisor to the Executive Office of the President of Republic Indonesia from 2015 to 2019. I feel so honored to be invited in this esteemed panel. So thank you, Jaya, for reaching out to me and including me in this very important discussions. And I would echo what Bene said earlier, and John follow up, that this panel especially interesting because we are using a positive framework and looking into the opportunities and options, how CSO and state could work together, how the state could strengthen the role of CSO in delivering democracy. So before going into that, I would just like to highlight about maybe too often analysis and information that we have heard recently about the state of our democracy. Recently, for example, the economic, I'm just quoting the Economist Intelligence Unit recently released the Global Democracy Index, in which it concludes that the global democracy state is at stagnant. It has not increased from the 2021, which is under a pandemic. There are too many restrictions from the state. And now moving on to 2022, according to the report, only 8% of the total population globally live in a country that is full democracy, and nearly 50%, and this the figure is 43.5% lives in a somewhat democracy. Well, we can discuss at length about this report, but that's not the intentions of our panel tonight. But I would like to highlight is that we are facing this challenge on how to sustain our democracy, especially this economists, they measure democracy against political culture, among others, civil liberties, functioning of governments, political participations. And just on that, there are another report about shrinking civic space, in which this is released from by Civicus, at 117 countries out of 197 countries still use repressive tactics such as physical harassment and murder, negative discourse, labeling, restrictive legislation, etc. Having seen that, as CSO activists, the immediate question that would come to me and many of us, I guess, as a CSO activists, what shall we do? What kind of political strategies that we have to do? How we should hold the government accountable? What kind of intervention we should do to bring back democratic ecosystems? Now, what I will say here that we have to remember that currently our democracy lives in a pretty different context than it was 20, 30 years ago. Democracy is now, it lives in the ecosystem where the key players, not just only civil society, non-state actor, state and private sector, but there's also the influence of IT, social media, and now the use of artificial intelligence. Just like John said earlier, that yes, even in the shrinking civic space, the social media has become the heaven for activists to still hold the government accountable, to promote on anti-corruptions, to promote transparency, participations. But on the flip of it, we also experience how social media has been used to broadcast fake news, disinformation that leads into that resulted in what we call FUD, fear, uncertainties, and doubt. When people are presented with such huge hoax and disinformation and embrace in a FUD situation, they will not be able to think clearly. And we have seen the result. The US 2016 election, the Brexit, the January 6th Capitol demonstration, etc. And in this context, I would say that yes, the government has a role to initiate dialogue, to persuade the social media companies to practice good governance. And what I learned just recently is that TikTok has started saying that now you can look into our data. They are saying to the US government, you can keep your data in your cloud, and you can use it for scrutiny if necessary. But what TikTok is doing is very different from Facebook, Instagram, etc. TikTok is not using the social graph, but it's using they are persuading, they are encouraging people to develop creative content, whereas Facebook, Instagram, they can be used to broadcast the fake news, etc., because they are targeting the audience based on the social data, on the data of their user. So in this context, what I think we should think together, because this is really a different context now with all social media, and we mustn't forget that AI is not you. It's now they can copy public figures and copy the voice, and they can twist what, just say for example, what Obama was saying, and people would believe that. People just, you cannot distinguish which one is the real video of Obama and which one is the fake video of Obama. I think we are facing this. We are facing this as well. So civil society also needs to be able to understand these challenges, needs to be able to adapt to the situations, need to speed up its knowledge, and this is where the government comes, because it is the interest of the government to have a civic sphere that is not murky with fake news, but is productive with positive conversation. So the capacity building for the CSO in understanding this, and also not regulating the social media companies, but persuading them to establish a standard of good governance, and also start, I think, a discussions of agreement between social media and the G20 countries about what is the best practice, how we can help each other. I think I will just stop here, but if you talk about Indonesia, we also experienced a very bad presidential election in 2019 because of the divisive, because of the use of fake news, because of the use of political identity, because of the use of religion. Now the community is greatly divided. We have come together, but because the President Jokowi is a person who embraced everyone. So he invited his opponent to become the minister in the cabinet. And there's a lot of campaign about tolerance, about religious tolerance. And this is also where the society and the state could work together in creating a safe space for tolerance and religious tolerance. So I think I would end here. It's I'm aware about the time. Just cut me, Shauri, if I'm speaking too long. But I think I would just end my introduction here. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinny. You maintained exact 10 minutes, not even 1 second more. Thank you for that. Yeah. Now we go to Mexico. We have Gloria from Mexico. So I request Gloria, please share your thoughts and experiences.
Hi, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate.
Gloria, may I ask you to put on your camera, please, if possible? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion, and I'm happy to hear from other voices the challenges that we're now facing. I think that as it was proposed, it's very interesting to try to find out some of the ways in which civil society is organizing to face the challenges that we have been facing for a long time. But unfortunately, what I see is that things are not coming as we were expecting. I think that things are, in many cases, things are becoming much more difficult and even very challenging for many of us. I mean, I think that there's no doubt of the existence of an inherent relationship between the concept of democracy and citizen participation. The very quality of democracy in a country is measured by the roles and participation of citizens in public affairs, in addition to the respect of the right to free expression, public demonstration, and association. We are clear that countries need a strong and critical civil society with possibilities for an open dialogue with governments and build consensus to enrich government actions and public policies. In this sense, I think the social place of organizations is very important to plan an informative, consultative, deliberative, and implicative role. However, filling this role is not possible if the system of the government does not establish real mechanisms that guarantee the support of the institutions to have basic information, controlled management of mutual protection, and a good definition of the scope of participation. This in order to avoid false consequences, totally contrary to those we have expected. In Mexico, civil society organizations have been protagonists of the democratization process for many years. Although it was not easy to move from being seen as a social threat to that of legitimate interlocutor. Today, we can certainly say that their proposals have resulted in important frameworks and legal reforms. Civil society projects have contributed to improving the quality of life of millions of people and have incorporated issues into public policies for the construction of an inclusive and even a more just country. Different authorities in the last 5 or 4 decades have recognized the vision and work of the civil society to place issues on the public agenda, such as the defense of human rights, the rejection of discrimination, and the need to recognize ourselves as diverse and as an inclusive society. Even the contribution to value the community, as well as maybe one of the main challenges that we are now facing is the role of transparency and accountability. Although important progress have been made in this recognition, it is well known to everyone that today's social organizations face difficult situations in different parts of the world. I know. I mean, the news every day show us the situation that the civil society is facing in countries like Iraq, Iran. But I will mention only a few examples from Latin America, where reality has drastically changed, as some governments have discredited the work and contribution of social organizations, and in different ways have returned to persecuting them. Since his campaign, Bolsonaro in Brazil has clearly indicated its animosity towards social organizations. Despite the hard work developed to alleviate hunger and save the lives of thousands of people from the favelas, indigenous and Afro-Brazilian people mired in poverty, they were the object of discredit and persecution. Not forgetting the situation that social organizations have suffered in Nicaragua since 2018, where more than 3,000 organizations lost their official registration due to governmental orders seeking to exercise absolute control and silence society, persecute those who have a different opinion, and establish a single thought, violating the human rights of the Nicaraguan people. In Mexico, we are really surprised that the current government took a major turn in the dialogue processes that were being built when just 2 months after its installation, he prohibited any government support for cooperation to Mexican organizations, harming stability and sustainability, especially to those smaller that today many have disappeared. But it has not been only that. On different occasions, he has pointed out international cooperation that supports social organizations as political interfering. And since 2022, he sought that organizations do not receive donations from the private sector. These economic affectations hurt the backbone of the organizations, not only for the development of their activities, but for their very subsistence. But the attacks have not been limited to economical aspects. And on many public mentions, they have been described as intermediaries and pointed out as enemies of the government, conservatives, and contrary to social transformation. They have been linked to corruption cases without carrying out any investigation and the corresponding sanction in a clear attempt to social discredit. The president seeks to monopoly on social action. He intends to rebuild a central government, but above all, it must trust right defenders, as well as those who point out errors in the government. It is clear that when governments open faces for action and active participation to organization, they listen and value their proposals, democracy is strengthened. While the deterioration of democracies becomes evident when social organizations are discredited and persecuted. However, in Brazil, as in Nicaragua and Mexico, social organizations have not been defeated. As I have pointed out, despite the limitations, they have continued their projects and saved many lives. They have been the voices that have revealed the prevailing precariousness in their countries, as well as the vexations that society faces, and resorted into intergovernmental spaces for their support. In Mexico, fortunately, we observe a non-consistent government system in which, beyond economic limitations, there are some ways for interactions, communications, and even joint actions. It is not easy, but it is possible. At the same time, it seems that the networks have expanded and strengthened. We prepared joint diagnoses and reports that allow us to be up to date on the social reality we face, while at the same time strengthening ourselves. Our presence in intergovernmental spaces is constant, from where we broaden our social and political linkages and perspectives that strengthen daily local work. As it has been said, the participation of the civil society organizations is really important in building the democracy. And I think that all governments have to be very clear about which kind of country, which kind of society they are building. Now that we are facing many backlashes, not only in Mexico, but in many countries, I think that we have had to look some other opportunities. You have already mentioned the media as an important tool. And even the link with the universities that give us
Gloria,
the
we have
opportunity.
1 minute to close.
Yes, that give us the opportunity to form a new work teams and receive some of the support that we need. I believe that strength, solidarity, and a collective vision also arise from our precariousness that make it possible to maintain the strength and hope for a better future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Gloria, for that rich experience sharing from your country. Now we have from America, the last speaker. So while Douglas speak, I request participants, you try to put your, I see 3-4 people raising hands. I don't know if you're raising hands to put questions. So if it is to put question, please put your question in the question and answer box. And also, if you want to specifically ask some speaker, put the name also. So that will be easy for us to know whom you are asking. So when we read the question, we can straight away put the question to the concerned speaker. Okay. So now we have Douglas from America. So Douglas, it's you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I'll try to speak quick so that we can get some time for dialogue with the participants. But I want to just highlight that although I'm from America and grew up here and have my professional life here as a professor of business and management and leadership, I'm also a China scholar, and I've spent most of my career thinking about economic development in China and the ways in which particularly American corporations are contributing to that. And so given that what I'm going to talk about has to do with the role of three sectors, you asked us to talk about the role of the state, but I'm also going to talk about the role of the corporate sector and the role of nonprofit organizations. And I think the case of China is an interesting sort of contrast or guidepost. So I'm going to mention a few things about that there as well. I think it's a really interesting thing to think about what the role of the corporation is in society, but also the role of the corporation for civil society. We have a very interesting dance in the United States between the state, which both exists at the federal level, but also at the state level, but also the growing power of the corporation that has transformed in fundamental ways over the course of the last 50 years. I hope my comments don't come out too negative in this discussion, but I'm quite down on where America is in the declining civil society here. And if I had to pin my blame on one person, it would be Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, for those who may remember, was Ronald Reagan's senior economic advisor. He won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1986. And he was widely known as the sort of, if you think of the evolution of America's economy, and you can say the same about probably a lot of European economies, you know, we really in the middle of the 20th century were a Keynesian-based economic system, which meant we all accepted that the state played an important role in moderating what the corporate sector did and in helping to build the nonprofit sector, and in other words, build a civil society, which is the interaction of all of those players. Milton Friedman was famous for having written an article that appeared on the cover of the New York Times Magazine in 1970, saying the only responsibility of corporations is to increase profit for shareholders. They have nothing to do, no responsibility for unions. They have no responsibility for civil society or nonprofit organizations. And it is just irresponsible. Now, of course, Friedman draws his intellectual insights, he claimed, from Adam Smith, saying that markets are the most efficient system and we should just let markets do their magic and everybody will be better off. Of course, it looks to me like Milton Friedman never read Adam Smith, because as we all know, Adam Smith was actually a political economist who thought a lot about the role of the state in the market. He just has the famous line that led to the invisible hand notion. But the point being, Friedman made the argument, and he was part of the University of Chicago School of Economics. And he made the very clear argument that markets are the most efficient way to allocate resources. Now, what we have seen in the period since Friedman sort of won that argument, and we've seen a decline in the corporate role in the civil society and civil sector. In the United States, we have seen the greatest transfer of wealth from the lower income and working class group of society to the upper 1% of the society in the history of the country. It has been a dramatic transformation of wealth, a transfer of wealth for that role. Now, to get to the kind of core question, because this isn't just a screed about corporate wealth, corporate profits in the top 1% of society, the important thing for me is really this question of how we incentivize people and corporations to build a functioning civil society, one in which everybody is coming together to really think cleverly and clearly about building a community level infrastructure. Now, I'm going to talk mostly about the organizations for the next few minutes. One of our speakers here also talked about social media and what's happening in terms of the ways in which people are interacting. And I think, you know, the last 5 years have been a startling and frightening way of thinking, not just about the toxicity of social media, but also about the ways in which people are sort of moving away from face-to-face interactions in community level organizational infrastructure in civil society. So I'm not an expert in that area, and I'm not going to talk anymore about it, but it seems very, very dangerous to me. Now, what I would like to just emphasize here, and this is the reason I raise China as an example, is in the United States, when we had a well-functioning civil society, you had, of course, the federal government, which was building a legislative infrastructure and, represented, elected by the people for the people. But of course, the United States, being United States, is known as being a system of independent legislatures that have different political stripes, but are allowed to actually build local level systems of the kind of civil society that they want. And probably the important unit of analysis here is not the state, but actually the municipality or city level. Years ago, in the midst of all of my China research, I was also doing work on the American corporation, and we started studying the ways in which corporations are incentivized to play roles here in helping build community level infrastructure at their local municipalities and local civil societies in which they're headquartered. And there are different strategies here. Now, here again, one of the reasons I mentioned China is China's success in economic development over the last 40 years. We often think of it as just a one-party authoritarian system that is aggressively setting markers for what they want the economic development process to be. But I and my colleagues write about what Andy Walter called China's magic being the local governments as industrial firms. And so the basic idea here is, in well-functioning systems, and I'm not making any claims about China's kind of democratization of civil society at all, but in terms of well-functioning economic development systems, you have central goals, but you also have very decentralized players at the province and municipal levels that have all kinds of incentives to be entrepreneurial in the development of their areas. In the United States, we used to have this. In the middle part of the 20th century, and in one study that I oversaw, we looked at the history of 3 different types of cities. We looked at Cleveland, an old school manufacturing city, Atlanta, sort of the lower South, headquartered where the headquarters of Coca-Cola and others. And then we looked at Seattle, sort of new economy city. And we really wanted to map the ways in which corporations were giving back to the local infrastructure and building community level organizational systems. Now, we have seen a dramatic decline on that participation in the last 50 years. It used to be the case that in terms of what corporations and individual citizens were contributing to cities and contributing to their states in terms of their tax burden, it was both about at 50% each. Today, that has held steady for individuals, and corporations have dropped to about 3%. So we've just seen a flight of capital. We've seen an anti-unionization. We've seen corporations, if they're still involved in philanthropic opportunities, they're doing it in sort of very high-profile international abroad issues. And so what it's led to is a hollowing out of the community level infrastructure that, again, requires 3 players. It requires the state, it requires nonprofit organizations and sort of civil organizations, but it also requires participation from the corporate sector. Corporations have to be players in building the community level organizational infrastructure that leads to a healthy civil society. And what we've seen in the United States is a decline in that civil society. We've seen a flight of capital by corporations. We've seen a decline in the civil society infrastructure that builds on these 3 legs of the stool together. And to go back to the title of this wonderful webinar, we've seen a decline in democratization. If you think that markets are the most effective idea for democracy, which apparently Milton Friedman was saying, let the invisible hand of the market decide these things. In fact, the markets favor people who have power and resources. That's it. And so if you're not going to have a state that plays an effective role and thinking about how to moderate and build a community level organizational infrastructure, you're going to fail. Now, let me give you one, and on a positive note, and then just stop, because I know we need to get to our conversation. When I was doing work on this in the 1990s and 2000s, we were trying to find examples that really worked. And one of them actually came during the Milton Friedman era. So you'll remember at that time, we had a very conservative executive branch in Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman. But the House and the Senate were controlled by Democrats. And the Tax Reform Act of 1986 was a very, very regressive tax. It lowered the tax rates for corporations and for wealthy individuals by a tremendous amount. But Bill Bradley was able to get in, who was a Democrat in the Senate at the time, and I think Richard Durbin also was in the House. They put in this little hidden piece called the low-income housing tax credit. And what it did was it looked like it set up incentives for corporations to get tax credits by investing in low-income housing. What it did, though, is it created a very, very exciting civil society organization around taking corporate resources, building community-level organizations that then built low-income housing for people in several cities. Now, it worked differently in different cities. When we studied Cleveland, it was an amazing system. Atlanta, pretty good, but not as good as Cleveland because they didn't have as many community-level organizations, the CBOs, community-based organizations. And Seattle was sort of a disaster with it. Seattle probably had less need in terms of poverty, but the corporations were just focused on big ideas and international things. Anyway, my point is there are ways to create incentives at the federal level and at the state level that can build the incentives for corporations and nonprofit organizations and local governments to work together to build community level organizational infrastructure that leads to a viable civil society and leads to better democracy. And I think in the United States, if it's an example of anything over the last 30 years, is that this is just, we've seen a frightening decline in these areas. So I'll just stop there, and sorry to be dour, but I want to give a real story of what's actually happening here. And back to you, Chairman.
Yeah. Thank you, Douglas, for sharing that experience and your thought process. Now we go to the question and answers. I think we have a few questions. Now we are talking about democracy, which gives right to express question, right? So all of you are feel free to ask the speakers. I think we have 2 or 3 questions already in the question box. There is one question: is that the civil liberty societies are often mistaken for some left organizations or non-traditional. What the civil liberty societies are doing to erase this image, particularly so in a world often misled by fake stories on social media. Maybe I'll ask Benny to answer this.
This is very good questions. Yes, civil liberty is always mistaken as a life organization. But I think that this is actually the homework for CSOs who are actually not so, I mean, we CSO dear for an ideal, but not necessarily ideological left or center or right. We usually work based on programs. We work for more democracy. We work for human rights. We fight for anti-corruption. So I would say how we distinguish ourselves from the leftist organization is that we don't only work based on ideology, but we work for a cause for everyone. If civil society work on anti-corruption, then it is anti-corruption. They would embrace as many followers, be it right, left, or center. And the same is true. We work for the fulfillment of SDGs, no one left behind. Then we will make sure that we will give the voice to the voiceless that we will work at the grassroots level, and we don't mobilize them for political causes. So I hope this answered the question. Thank you, Shauri.
Yeah, thank you. We have one more question from America, from Lauren. Democracy may not be sustainable without good governance, which requires accountability and transparency. To that effect, what specific role can civil society play to maintain the balance between accountability and weaponizing? John, can you take this from Canada?
Sure, thanks. That's a very good question, and I would say that one of the key elements to this is evidence-based advocacy. When it's grounded in evidence, accountability can be part of a process of governance. Like, let's say there are some examples of like open parliament or open government, OGP. There are some initiatives where civil society find entry points to have a say, but also have some visibility on the budget, the public budget cycle, for instance. They have that. That means knowing the workings of the state's institutions and build advocacy initiatives grounded in facts and evidence and knowledge. I think that's the key. But there is another element that is tied to the previous question. It's like a lot of time there is this trap where civil society organizations act as opposition parties. I mean, it's based on the nature of the work that they do. It's like, and governments tend to make that willful comparison or blend them together to discredit civil society organizations, even though they have legitimate concerns, legitimate recommendations, but they will tend to say, well, they are in bed with the opposition. They are working with the opposition, and they are just, thus far, they're just raising political points. So I think on both sides, there are things to do. Civil society organizations understand that their role as advocates or as watchdog, they will do so irrespective of those who are in power today and tomorrow. But I think one of the key elements for not weaponizing it is to be grounded through evidence, but also on values and principles. When it's about values and principles, then you have the higher ground and you have the legitimacy to move forward, irrespective of those who are in power. That's what I would want to say.
Yeah. Thank you. We have one question from Sri Lanka. We have implemented Right to Information Act in 2016, but still people are not much empowered to use the available resources. What CSO can do to empower people? Maybe I ask Gloria if you can answer this.
Well, yes, I think that adding to what John has said, I think that it is very important that the civil society organizations play a very important role in giving people the information about the tools, the different tools they have. I mean, thinking about transparency and accountability, there are some tools, within the governmental system, there are some institutions that bring us the opportunity to have this information, and I think that the organizations play a very important role to defend this kind of institutions, but informing people of how to use these tools. I think that in many cases, there's there's no information available for everybody to really use the tools that we have already built on. And we have to be very clear about it.
Yeah, thank you. We have last question that is in the chat box. I will take that from chat box. What are the enabling policy measures that states should take to make governance more inclusive of people at the grassroots in decision making, not just as a beneficiary? Douglas, can you please take this question?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question, and it's a very difficult balance to strike. And as I mentioned in my example on the low-income housing tax credit, what you need is you need strategic action at the state level, and the state being the sort of macro state, like the federal government, and then you need engaged action at the society level. So the civil society organizations which engage in these processes. And when you have this sort of dance between two parties on these two levels that are committed to the idea of building a viable civil society that increases democracy or strengthens democracy is probably a better way of saying it, then they have to bring the third party in. And bringing that third party in is hard because, again, as corporations have more and more power and more resources, they become more and more independent. But I'm not here to advocate for laws that sort of smash corporations or decline or diminish corporate power. But I am very interested in corporations being brought to the table and coming to the table. And the three groups and all of us who are part of these different three groups hold each other accountable. So I'm not here, I'm a business school professor. I believe in economic growth and development, and I'm thinking creatively about how to create viable development in all countries. But I also believe that we need to all be at the table, not yelling at each other, but we need to all be at the table and pass legislation that creates not just the rules, but also the incentives for corporations to participate as equal partners in building these local communities. And it's not just because it's the right thing to do. It's because economic viability is a better thing. It makes countries safer and better for all populations, including those who have less, the parts of the population that have less resources. But it also creates economic growth. It creates a better, more stable society. I mean, in the United States, for example, the longest period of sustained economic growth was the 40 years post-World War II. And that was because we lived in a Keynesian-style economic system in which the government incentivized corporations to build a beautiful manufacturing supply chain. And we had small pockets of labor and industrial clusters spread throughout the country. And by the way, again, it's something that China is doing very well right now. And I'm not here to argue that civil society and democracy are healthy in China, but in thinking of that kind of dance between the federal government and local governments, and then local governments using the tools that the federal governments can give them to incentivize both the local political economy, the local community-based organizations, and the corporations to come to the table. That's what we need. And so I think that kind of accountability comes through everybody sitting down at the table and realizing we're all partners in this process. So I'll stop there and just thank you for listening.
Thank you, Douglas. And I also thank all the speakers for sharing your experience, which is very, very inspiring to all the participants. So now I request from Italy, right? Benedetto, you can take it forward.
I'm here. Thank you so much for everybody, for every word you said, because it was really, really, really interesting to listen to you. Maybe I have to go to America and to take some course for economy from Douglas, because he really opened, but to systemize some thoughts that I have in mind. That's okay. I'm coming, okay? So then, some word cloud about our discussions today, just to see what we discussed, there are some really stones that I want to put under your attention. The first, relationships is the word. Cooperation, network, that were words repeated. Transparency, accountability, freedom, private sector, tools, third part, economy, and decentralization. Let me just resume like this. So we just all together underline that we need, and there is a need of a relationship that has to be regulated in a sense to avoid the relationship between the state and the civil society organization, that need to be regulated in a sense to avoid persecution, like somebody cited in Brazil or in Nicaragua or in other part of the world, and continue to be bodies that enhance democracy and participation. But state and civil society, we understood today that are not the only two actors anymore. There is a new world. So there are corporations, there are media, the past, let me say, the old media, the traditional media, and the new media. If I can give you an example, for example, how is affected the world mind, the work of a network or a corporation like Netflix. I can say that the battle, the struggling for the LGBTQIA plus community was taken a lot of good effort from the Netflix products. But what if they think in the opposite way? We are saying, oh yes, Netflix is really good about the transsexual. What if they sell different products with different aims? Where are the check and balance that usually democracy had? Where are the boundaries? We say something about corporation and the relation with the state. We are speaking about states. Somebody of you said the G20 states are to do something together. Where is the United Nations in this sentence, in these things? That is the only table that we are, where all the voices with all the cultures and the states can come together. But I don't want to be a speaker. I'm just a resuming machine. So there are corporation, media, social media, and are as new actors too. So, and we have to put a big attention, a huge attention on how we can decentralize the attention for the local background. Let me say, I'm president of an organization that gathering together local level, cities, put together to fight against racism and discrimination. I was implied as person, as local actor. I was elected at the town council. I was a deputy mayor. I know how it's difficult to treat in the local, because this is the other word that we need, are resources, financial resources. And where is it the social responsibility of the corporations? Where are the laws that defend humanity to somebody that is not playing right in this field? So just to close, this relationship has to be built, and to build spaces in which that voices of the civil society can be heard. It is a cost. This is a cost, but it's the cost of democracy. Nothing else to add. No, I have it. I was a liar, sorry. About the decentralization, let me, Yaya, remember all of the speaker, but also the audience, that tomorrow we will have the webinar that is absolutely about that, about decentralizing democracy. It's tomorrow, if I don't remember wrong, from 1:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. India time. I don't know if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, please correct me. Thank you so much.
You're very much right, Benedetto. The time is right, 1:30 to 3, and the topic is the same. Thank you all for a fantastic deliberation this evening at India, and immense contribution from each one of you, I would say, and a fantastic way to discuss the whole aspect of deepening democracy. Thank you again. And it was wonderful working with all of you, participants and the speakers.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Good evening. Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Good evening,
Thank you
good
for
evening,
having
good
me.
morning, and good night for somebody.
Thank
Have a
you. Good
wonderful
night
day.
for me. Good morning. Good
Thank
evening.
you all. Thank you all
Thank
for
you very
having me.
much for sharing and
Thank
for
you,
making
Yaya.
the summary, for organizing. Very nice meeting you all.
Very nice to
Thank
meet you.
Vicky.
You all.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
I'll look forward to the next time we're together.
Thank you.
Of course.
Inshallah.
Thanks to all the
Douglas,
participants.
Douglas, I will
Yeah.
ask the organizer for your contact if it's possible.
Please do. I would love to talk more. It sounds like we have a lot
Thank
to
you
talk
so
about.
much indeed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much indeed. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Douglas. We can close.